بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our 17th class of an introduction to the sciences of Hadith. And this will be our last class in terms of the content. So content-wise, this is going to be the last class, in terms of new content at least. In the coming classes, we just have review, and then we have a quiz. And then we have the final session, which is just going to be an open platform for Q&A, inshallah. So this is actually our last class in terms of our content. Now, in terms of our course book, we've completed the course book last week, as many of you probably seen in the syllabus. That last week we finished this entire book, alhamdulillah. And even more than this, because some of them we had separate handouts or separate lectures as well. But we have completed this. In the last class, we ended off with the topic of weak hadith or da'if hadith. And we spoke about the final categories of da'if hadith because we did that over two separate classes. And in that, we also tackled the question of, can you use a weak hadith? And we gave the different opinions that are out there. Generally, there's two major views, or we gave three, but there's two you can kind of say. One says it's permissible, one says it's not permissible at all whatsoever. The second view is that it's permissible with conditions. Pretty much that recaps it. So the first view, not permissible at all. As long as it's da'if, you can't use it. The second view is that it is permissible as long as it meets certain conditions. So they put some conditions, and we did those conditions as well. For those that want to look into the details of that and might have missed it, that's in our last class, class 16. So that is in terms of the permissibility of using a weak hadith. For today's session, which is our final session, the topic is the relationship, right? The connection, the overlap, the role of hadith in fiqh. So this overlap of hadith into fiqh. That what is the perspective of hadith? How is hadith used in fiqh? And again, this is more of an introduction into the concepts that are used on the side of fiqh. So this whole entire series has been more so into the science of hadith, into how it's structured within the hadith sciences, how the terminology is determined within the hadith sciences, what a certain word like hadith, like khabar, what do these words mean when it comes to the muhaddithin, the scholars of hadith. None of it was according to fiqh, even though we did give some examples along the way. Today's class will be that overlap, will be the transfer of these hadith, right? After we've classified it in the different classifications that we learned. So we've classified it whether the chain goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, whether the chain goes to the companion, whether the chain goes to the tabi'i, whether the chain even goes further, that the Prophet ﷺ is saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. So you can classify it in that way, whether we've classified it based off of the amount of sanads, the amount of chains there are, whether it's mutawatir, right, meaning there's so many chains, or it's khabr ahad or khabr wahid, which is a certain or a limited amount of chains, not necessarily one, but it can be minimum three, it can be two, it can be one, and it can be higher than three depending on how you categorize hadith mutawatir. So whether you're categorizing it that way, then you can even go further and categorize a hadith based off of its strength. Whether a hadith is sahih. In order to be sahih, it has to meet those five conditions. Or a hadith is hasan. In order to be hasan, it has to meet those five conditions with an ease on one of the conditions, which is dabt. Whether it is classified as da'if because it does not meet one of those five conditions completely. And that condition can be somebody missing from the chain, that condition can be a hidden defect, whatever that condition may be, that's another classification of hadith as well. So after learning all of those classifications, Now we will look at how the hadith scholars use it. And this is probably one of the most important lessons that we're building towards, because this helps us understand why in certain fiqh you don't have that school of thought, that madhab, that fiqh following the hadith that you might have read, right? This is a very common question that we might come across. And this is a common question that somebody might pose to us as well, that, okay, why do you pray this way? Or why do you do this? There's a hadith that says this. Look, this hadith is in Bukhari, or this hadith is in Muslim, right? We're building our foundation to this understanding that we should be able to know why the hadith scholars might not be using it. We might not be able to pinpoint the exact reason, but we will know that it's not most likely due to the lack that they didn't come across that hadith. That, oh, this is a sahih hadith, that one of the four madhabs didn't come across it. Rather, the realistic reason is that they don't accept that hadith as being completely sahih or applicable for various reasons. And we will look at some of those common reasons today. So this is, and again, this is also because of a certain trend that we have around the world, which is that you have to follow the Quran or Sunnah, right? And this is a very newer kind of trend, you can say. Traditionally, it was that the schools of fiqh, the madhabs, would develop and would take from the Quran, from the hadith, put it through the system, and then develop Islamic law. Whereas nowadays you have some people saying that we can just go back to the Quran and Sunnah directly, and decide for ourselves, which is technically impossible, right? You can't, and that's because you'll have two hadith that might say opposite things. Which one will you choose? What if they're both categorized as sahih because they meet those 5 conditions, right? Are you qualified enough to look into the defects? Are you qualified enough to have those other conditions met or whatnot? So at an individual level, it's technically impossible that I give you the Quran and I give you or hand you Sahih al-Bukhari and I tell you, show me how to pray, or give me all of the conditions of prayer, all of the conditions of wudu, or whatever it may be, and you're able to determine that directly. You will be relying on somebody's understanding of it. So at the end of the day, that understanding can be one of the major madhabs, one of the major schools of fiqh, and or it can be some local scholar or whatnot. And again, today this is our goal, that we want to see how these scholars are using it. So let's begin with a very common example in the Maliki madhab. So you have this. So what we'll do is we'll begin with this example in the Maliki madhab, and then we'll shift over to the Hanafi madhab. But before we begin both of those examples, let's lay down this foundation. Each and every madhab, each and every school of fiqh, a madhab is a school of law. So a way of looking at the Islamic law, and a way of determining what is the legal ruling, meaning what are the conditions of prayer, how do you pray or whatnot. Any of these legal schools are completely valid and perfectly fine to follow. Again, there's just a difference of opinion in terms of how they determine what is right or what is wrong. Very similar to the difference of opinion that whether you need 10 chains to be mutawatir, or you need 9, or you need 8. It's just a different perspective on how many chains you need for a hadith to be mutawatir versus mashhur, right? Remember we did that? So depending on what the scholar is classifying it as, they'll put it in that category. Similar to that, in the realm of fiqh, scholars have their own ways of determining what is applicable, what is legal law, right? What is the legal ruling, and what hadith or what Quran or what principle you need to follow. And all 4 schools have their own methodology. All 4 schools have their own methodology of how they deal with hadith as well. So for example, in the Shafi'i school, Imam al-Shafi'i was of the idea, very strongly bases it off of Sahih and Da'if, determined similar to how the scholars of hadith determine it. So that if it's Sahih, we should be basing it, the value of that hadith, off of whether it's Sahih or Da'if, not whether it's Mutawatir or Ahad, right? Remember we differentiated that one of the classifications of hadith is Mutawatir or Ahad. One of the classifications is Da'if or Sahih. Imam Shafi'i pays a lot more attention to the classification that it's sahih and da'if, right? That if it's sahih, right, whether it's mutawatir sahih or it's khabr wahid sahih. Remember, both can be sahih, right? Whether it's sahih, so if a mutawatir is by default sahih, right? And if it's sahih in khabr ahad, then pretty much they're equal, right? We're using them on the same playing field. Whereas the Hanafi methodology or even the Maliki methodology is different to that. It's that mutawatir has more chains. And because it has more chains, even though both might be sahih, mutawatir will always hold value. And because it holds a higher value due to its chains, we will only permit a hadith, right, or a narration that has similar amount of chains, meaning it's categorized as mutawatir, to change a mutawatir ruling. So to change a mutawatir ruling, we would only allow that. It's kind of like this. It's qualifications, right? So let's put it like this. Let's say in this class right now, we have certain students that have PhDs, certain students that have masters, certain students that have bachelors. And we make a rule that, okay, anybody, you can either base it off of this. I'm of the opinion that anybody who has a degree in engineering, whether it be a bachelor's, a master's, or a PhD, we will value their opinion the same, right? Because we're just looking for the opinion in engineering. We don't really care of what level, you just need some qualification in engineering, and we'll allow your opinion to come through. Another person might say, no, hold a second. We will only allow if the opinions contradict. So if we have somebody who has a bachelor's in engineering versus somebody who has a PhD in engineering, we will only allow that opinion of the bachelor's person if it doesn't contradict the PhD person's opinion, right? Because the PhD has higher qualifications. So it's similar to that. It's similar to the idea that because there's more qualifications that a mutawatir goes through, that there's so many chains, there's multiple chains, that you can't say it's equal to a khabr ahad, a hadith that only has a few chains, right? And that's just one way of looking at it. Imam Shafi'i didn't look at it that way. He is of the opinion that if it's sahih and it checks those 5 conditions that we talked about, it's as good as any other hadith. And it's a matter of perspective. Now, based off of that, because Imam Shafi'i is now saying that a hadith that is khabr ahad can change something that is mutawatir, and he's fine with it. Whereas Imam Malik or Imam Abu Hanifa would not be fine with it. And because they won't allow it to do that, you will have different outcomes. You will have different rulings at the end of the day. And it goes back to this principle of how fiqh overlaps, or how hadith overlaps into fiqh, and how the scholars of fiqh use hadith and what conditions they place on hadith. Now let's take this example from the Maliki school, where one of the conditions for accepting khabr ahad, and most of the time when you're talking about hadith and the acceptance of hadith, we're dealing with khabr ahad or khabr wahid. That's the majority of the time. That's where the major differences come. And that's because mutawatir are known as qat'i. Now you might have somebody not classify a hadith as mutawatir, but that's different. So it's pretty much agreed upon that if it's mutawatir, it's of the highest level. That's agreed upon by almost all fuqaha. What might not be agreed upon again is what makes it mutawatir. Is it 10 chains? Is it 20 chains? Is it 5 chains? Right? That might be different. But if it's categorized as mutawatir, it's pretty much out of discussion. They hold it to the highest value. Ahad is where our discussion is. Again, an ahad divides further. So not all ahad are the same. Remember, we have mashhur, we have aziz, aziz is 2. We have gharib, gharib is 1 chain. So depending on which type of ahad, that might have a different implication as well. So Imam Malik has an usul, a principle that if a khabr ahad or khabr wahid, right, the ones that are not mutawatir, contradicts the general qiyas, right? Contradicts a general principle, or and let's say general principle. That's probably the easiest way to understand this. If it contradicts the general principle, then the general principle takes precedent. So the general principle is what's going to be held to. And because of this ruling, we have in When it comes to fasting, we have the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he says, whoever eats or drinks forgetfully, right, that person's fast is not broken. Now, the Shafi'is, of course, take this because the hadith is sahih, it's fine, right, in terms of the 5 conditions. The Hanafis take it, but they take it istihsanan, right? It's another legal principle. So generally they wouldn't take it, but they override it and they allow it for other reasons, not because that's the general principle. The Malikis, however, it contradicts qiyas. And qiyas is the analogy or the general principle is if you eat or drink anything while you're fasting, right? Whether it be forgetfully, purpose, whatever the reason is, breaks your fast, right? Because what breaks your fast is something going down your throat and entering into the stomach. That's the principle, it breaks it. This is a khabr ahad and it contradicts the principle. And because it contradicts the principle, we're not going to take that hadith. So in the Maliki school, if you forgetfully eat or drink, your fast is broken. You have to make it up. You don't do the 60 days or anything of that sort, but you make up that one day, right? And you're not sinful, but you make up that one day. So your fast is broken because it contradicts, that narration contradicts the general opinion or reasoning. An easy way to think of this, right, is how the scholars of fiqh divide it. So this is the easiest way that we're gonna take it step by step. Once the scholars of hadith, right now let's go jump back into the realm of hadith. The scholars of hadith, they have mainly 2 jobs. The first job is to look at the sanad, right, of the hadith. The second job is the text of the hadith. Remember, we talked about the sanad and the matan, right? These are the main 2 jobs. Everything revolves around this. So in the sanad, for example, it has to be continuous, right? Each person in the sanad has to be dabt and adl, right? They have to be reliable, they have to be truthful. All of these things relate to the sanad. So they have to preserve, the scholar of hadith, they're doing 2 major jobs. They're preserving the sanad and the matan. They have to look for defects, nothing's missing. It's not the words of somebody else, it's the words of the Prophet ﷺ. So their relationship with the matan, they have to, everything revolves around that as well. Once these 2 jobs are complete, the job of the scholar of hadith is complete. So based off of this, the scholar of hadith is looking at the sanad, oh, somebody's missing. What's the hadith? You guys should know it by now. Da'if, right? Somebody's missing in the chain. Scholar of hadith is looking at this. The matan, there's defects in the matan. What's the ruling? Da'if. Scholar of hadith is looking at this. The sanad is good. It's continuous. Everybody is known as somebody that's trustworthy. Everybody has dhabt. Everything is fine. The matan is checked off. It's all fine. Meets the 5 conditions. The hadith is sahih, right? So that's the job of the scholar of hadith, the muhaddith. The scholar of hadith, their job is not to give you the fiqh ruling. So their job is not to tell you, okay, based off of me seeing this hadith checks off all the marks of being sahih, this is what you have to do. That's not the job of the scholar of hadith. That goes through a second filtration process. This body of hadith, after it's verified by the scholars of hadith, classified, right, eliminated, meaning the scholars of hadith are eliminating any liars, anybody that's fabricating. That's their job. They're eliminating, they're finding the defects, they're finding the issues, they're finding the hidden problems. Once they finish that bulk of hadith is then pretty much given to the fuqaha, or the scholars of fiqh. The scholars of fiqh are now looking at this. And again, it's not as simple as this, but we're simplifying it as much as we can. It's not like, a Ford factory or something, like, they're finishing step 1, then they pass it down, right? It's not in that simple way, but in a general sense. The scholars of fiqh, they take the hadith and then they put it through tests and conditions, right? Remember when we did munqati', hadith munqati'. Hadith munqati' is when something is missing from the chain. There's somebody missing from the chain. There's an inqita', there's something cut off in the chain. A mursal hadith is a narration that's missing the sahaba or sahabi. And that is a munqati' narration. That is an outward defect, right? Munqati', for example, when we talked about munqati', we said somebody's missing in the chain. And we spoke about different types of missing links in the chain. Somebody's missing from the top, somebody's missing from the bottom. 2 people are missing continuously, right? These are all apparent defects. This is known as the zahir, This is actual terms. So this is known as the zahir defect, a defect that is apparent. There's another classification of defects known as batin, hidden defects. And batin defects in the scholars of fiqh can be for various reasons. Remember, we touched upon few hidden defects, right? We just touched upon the general concept that if there's a hidden defect, the scholars of fiqh, this is the key point here, develop a whole system of hidden defects. Now, let's look at some of the hidden defects. And we'll be looking at some of the examples from the Hanafi madhab. For those that want to further read it, there is a very good book on this topic. Again, it's a very specific topic book. So if you're interested in the topic, it's called Introducing Hadith Studies by Dr. Safarooq Chaudhry. It's a very good read on the specific topic of how the Hanafi school uses hadith and how their methodology in hadith. So once you learn the general methodology, if you pick up this book and you read it, you'll have a better understanding of specifically how the Hanafi school uses it. So we'll look at some of the examples that he gives and that he mentions. And his book is not an original work. It's more of a compilation of the different sources of the Hanafi madhab. So he's putting together the usage of hadith in the Hanafi madhab in terms of it's not an original work in that way. Like he's not creating principles here. Okay. So we'll go through not all of them. We're just going to go through some of them. Number one, if a khabr wahid or khabr ahad contradicts, right, the Quran, right? Or actually, before we even do that, let's just talk about the general things that it can, the general reason why khabr ahad, not mutawatir, why khabr ahad is given this extra emphasis. Why are we looking for more defects? Why are we putting it through a second test? So, for example, if the hadith is from the scholars of fiqh or whoever is classified as mutawatir, they're not going to put it through these hidden batin principles, right? We're looking at khabr ahad for the batin, for the hidden defects. And these are the condition, these are the defects that we're looking for. Does it contradict the Quran? Does it contradict a sunnah that's mutawatir? Right? This is the exact terms that's used. And because you know these terms now, you should be familiar with it when it's used. Does it contradict a universal principle? These are things that you can write down. Number one, does it contradict the Quran? Does it contradict a sunnah mutawatira? Does it contradict a universal principle? We'll give examples of some of them. Does it contradict the intellect, right, or rational reasoning? Does it contradict ijma', right, the consensus of the scholars? Does it contradict or oppose the actions of the senior companions of the Prophet ﷺ? Does it contradict or oppose something that's widespread? Right? Does it oppose something that's widespread? Does it is it something that's contradicted by the narrator himself? Can it be an opinion of the companion rather than a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? So these are some of the examples that are mentioned, some of the hidden defects that you can look for. So, for example, if it contradicts a principle of the Quran, that's not an apparent defect. So from the outward, the hadith checks all of those 5 conditions that we talked about, right? However, there's that second test that the scholars of fiqh are going to put it to. Now, the scholars of fiqh, some scholars of fiqh might say, well, as long as it's sahih, it doesn't necessarily contradict the Quran, and I'm going to give you examples of that. All right, so let's turn to why we are giving this extra emphasis to khabr ahad. Right? Number one, the person transmitting the hadith could have made a mistake, right? Because it's not a widespread narration, it's only 1 or 2 chains narrating the hadith, there is a chance of mistake, right? And we're not saying that they're all perfect. And this mistake is a mistake. It doesn't mean that they're doing this on purpose. It could be a mistake or a misunderstanding. So, for example, we gave one of these examples previously, if you remember. We gave the hadith of Abdullah ibn Umar, if I remember correctly, and Aisha radiallahu anha corrected him, right? So hopefully you remember this example that we did before. We'll do a similar example, narrated also by Ibn Umar and Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. And they mention, now this hadith, it checks off all the five conditions that we're looking for. They mention that if there is bad luck, that the Prophet ﷺ said, if there is bad luck, it is in three things: houses, women, and horses. Right? Houses, women, and horses. And they say the Prophet ﷺ said this hadith. Now, this hadith checks off all the markings. However, there's a hidden defect. What is this defect? Aisha radiallahu anha refutes this hadith, and she clarifies this, and she says that they only heard the ending of the hadith. They entered the gathering at the end. She says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was speaking about the beliefs of the pre-Islamic Arabs, the beliefs, the notions that the Arabs had before Islam, the Jahiliyyah time, and the Jewish tribes that lived in that area as well. These notions that they had, that they believed that there is bad luck in houses, in women, in horses, right? The Prophet ﷺ didn't say that these things have bad luck. Rather, he was explaining some of the notions that they had. So Aisha radiallahu anha refutes that. However, the hadith stand alone, aside from the refutation of Aisha or the clarification of Aisha radiallahu anha, and as we discussed during our class on the women scholars of hadith, why Aisha's role is very important, because she gives us many of these principles and many of these this understanding of how to tackle certain narrations. So this hadith standing alone checks off all the marks, right? But it contradicts so many hidden defects that it has, that it contradicts some principles of Islam, that it doesn't fit in the general theme of the narrations that are there, the general theme of the Quran or whatnot. Then you have Aisha refusing this hadith. So the idea is that a transmitter could have made a mistake, right? It's not that they're perfect. And because the chances of mistakes in Khabr Ahad are higher, the scholars of fiqh put it through more tests and more requirement. That we're not saying it's guaranteed a mistake. We're not saying it is going to turn out to be a mistake. But we are saying that we will put more conditions to make sure that the chances of it being a mistake are nearly eliminated, right? Or completely eliminated, or at least very close to eliminated, that it is not going to be a mistake. So that's the first thing, right? Because Khabr Ahad has a higher chance, whereas Mutawatir has so many independent narrations, independent chains, that the likelihood of it being a mistake is near zero, right? That all of these, remember when we did the conditions of Khabr Ahad, right? All of these people could not have come together and agreed to lie about this. That's one of the conditions, right? And it has all of these independent chains going back to the Prophet ﷺ, that it pretty much can't be a mistake. Whereas Khabr Ahad doesn't have that same type of chains. It can be a Khabr Ahad Gharib, which means there's only one chain. And that one chain has a likelihood or a possibility of being a mistake, like we see here in this narration, and like we see in the example that we did earlier as well. Another possibility is that the report was not related, or was related in its meaning and not verbatim. So the report was, like, if I hear you saying something and I narrate what you said, but I kind of paraphrase it, or I try to portray the message of what you said. Now, sometimes this can be perfectly fine. Sometimes you can miss out important details, right? At the end of the day, if I'm not narrating it verbatim, I am, at the end of the day, narrating my understanding of what you're saying. So what I understand from what you're saying, that's what I'm narrating here. And if I do that, it can be correct, or I can miss out important details that somebody else might have caught on to. So if it's not verbatim, that's another issue as well. So this is why Khabr Ahad goes through those tests, whereas Mutawatir has independent chains verifying that these are the words that the Prophet ﷺ said, right? So we have that. All right. Another possible thing could be that the report has additions, or um, areas that the companion or one of the narrators are explaining within that hadith. So I hear something, I hear you say something, right? Let's say I hear you say class is at 5 o'clock or whatever it may be. And then I add, well, he said class is at 5 o'clock p.m. or he said class is at 5 o'clock in the evening. That could be correct, but that second portion is my explanation of what you're saying. That's an addition. Another possibility could be a deliberate fabrication, that purposely I just made up something about the Prophet ﷺ. And the chances of me purposely fabricating a hadith about the Prophet ﷺ is higher when I'm the only chain narrating it, right? If there's only one chain proving that that's a hadith, the chances of that are a lot higher. So the scholars of fiqh that develop this system, that if it's categorized as khabr ahad, we will add more conditions. And in the Hanafi madhab, there's nearly a dozen conditions that it has to meet if it's khabr ahad in order for it to be accepted. Nearly a dozen conditions, and we went through some of those conditions. So now let's look at some of the examples of the conditions we mentioned. The first one that we said was that khabr ahad must not oppose the Quran. It cannot contradict the Quran. Now this has kalam, this has details as well, because what is opposing the Quran? In the Hanafi madhab, if the Quran gives a certain ruling and the hadith gives a ruling that's slightly different, right, or not exact, that's a contradiction. In the Shafi'i madhab, not necessarily. So again, when you talk about what contradicts, what doesn't contradict, the terminology will be different based off of what that legal school is using as their terminology. That's why I said this is an introductory talk on this topic, that it's not completely detailed because there's so much to talk about at each one of these points. To give you an example, to highlight an example, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, فَقْرَؤُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنْ, that recite whatever is easy in the Quran, right? There's a hadith narrated by Aisha radiallahu anha, which is khabr ahad, khabr wahid. Now I should be able to use these terms with you, right? Which is khabr wahid, in which she says, لا صلاة لمن لا يقرأ فاتحة الكتاب. There is no prayer for the one that does not recite Surah Al-Fatiha, Fatiha al-Kitab. And in the Hanafi madhab, these two narrations contradict, because the Quran is saying recite whatever, and whatever is not a specific surah, right? That's simple as that. That's how they see it. The Shafi'is say that the Quran says recite whatever is easy, and the hadith explains what is easy. You see what they did there? So the Hanafis say reciting whatever, the Quran saying recite whatever is easy is not the same as recite Fatiha. The Shafi'is say Quran says recite whatever is easy, and the hadith explains what is easy. So they have two different views on this. Therefore, in the Hanafi madhab, right, it is fard, it is a rukn to recite. Recitation is a rukn. Reciting Surah Fatiha is wajib. Now, in the case of prayer, it doesn't matter, because if you skip a wajib on purpose, your prayer will be invalid. So the outcome is the same in both madhabs when it comes to prayer. Because in prayer, if you miss a wajib on purpose, right, your prayer is invalid. So both prayers, you have to recite Fatiha. But there's small differences that will take place. In the Shafi'i madhab, you have to recite Fatiha. If you leave Fatiha on purpose, it breaks your prayer, like the Hanafi madhab. But if you also leave it by accident, it breaks your prayer, right? So if you miss it forgetfully or anything, it breaks your prayer. In the Hanafi madhab, if you leave it forgetfully, it does not break your prayer. In the Shafi'i madhab, that's why after the Imam recites Surah Fatiha out loud, there's a pause, and people recite Surah Fatiha if they follow the Shafi'i madhab, whereas in the Hanafi madhab, they don't. And that's also the other thing that the Imam's recitation counts on your behalf. So again, because of that, these rulings, something simple as reciting Surah Al-Fatiha makes a difference. It will have a different effect. So the Quran, it cannot contradict a principle of the Quran. That's defect number one. So the Hanafis, if the Khabr Ahad contradicts it, they will not allow it to override. Now, as you saw that they took the hadith of Aisha, they don't reject the hadith, but they will give it a lower status. So instead of becoming fard, like in the Shafi'i madhab, the Quran, which is mutawatir, right? The principle in the Quran is whatever you want to recite or whatever you can. That's a higher level. They'll take the hadith and they'll place it under it. But this is wajib. They will not let it override it. They will not let it sit at the same level. That's the difference in outcome. So they don't reject it completely. That is in terms of contradiction of the Quran. Here's another very common example that you see, right? This is going to be very common that almost everybody here probably has heard of. Combining prayers, right? There's a difference of opinion. In the Hanafi madhab, you cannot combine prayers. In the Hanafi madhab, you cannot combine prayers. In the Shafi'i madhab, the Hanbali madhab, you can. The Maliki madhab, as far as I'm aware, I think you can as well, but don't quote me on the Maliki madhab on this issue. In the Hanafi madhab, you can't though. And this is because of the same reason. The hadith, all of the hadith that mention combining prayers are all in the category of, you guessed it, khabr ahad, khabr wahid. Whereas the Quran states that each prayer has its exclusive time. Each prayer has a precise time. Now that, right, is a qat'i proof. Qat'i means it's established through mutawatir. So if something's established through mutawatir, the level of proof is qat'i, and that's universal. That's a qat'i proof. Khabr ahad is always a dhanni proof, right? By default, khabr ahad is known as a dhanni proof. Because the Quran that ruling is established through mutawatir, we need what? What's the ruling? We need a mutawatir to change that ruling in the Hanafi madhab. Now the hadith that deal with combining prayers, because there are hadith and they are sahih, right? So you have hadith that meet the 5 conditions of being sahih, but that's not the end of it, right? Remember we said once they're determined sahih, that's just one classification. For the fuqaha, each madhab will have its own rulings on it. Each madhab will have their own conditions validifying the batin, the hidden defects, what they see as a hidden defect. So here you have this narration or these narrations contradicting the Quran, which is that the prayer has a specific time. However, the Hanafis don't reject the hadith. They interpret the hadith in a different way. They say that combining is jam' suri, what they call jam' suri, which is you pray dhuhr towards the end of dhuhr time. So let's say dhuhr is from 1 to 4 and asr is 4 to 6. You pray dhuhr 3:55 and then you pray asr at 4 o'clock. And that's like physically you're combining the prayers close to each other, but they're in their own valid times because of the principles of the Quran. So that is another example of why you'll have that difference of opinion in the madhab. And for people who don't understand where this comes from, many times you'll have them quoting and saying that, oh, maybe these scholars didn't come across the hadith. Maybe these scholars didn't see this hadith that talks about combining prayers. And in reality, that's usually like 99 point something not the case. Because if anybody opens the books of fiqh and actually does the research, they'll see that they discuss the same hadith and they'll tell you why they're not taking the hadith, and they'll discuss what they see as the hidden defects, the batin, that it contradicts the principles of the Quran or whatnot. So that is some of the examples. Let's look at some more examples so we can familiarize ourselves with these principles. We said it can't contradict an established sunnah. One of the sunnahs that are established mutawatir, meaning hadith. Right? Remember, hadith can be mutawatir or ahad. Mutawatir hadith, or the hadith in terms of the wiping over the socks. The mutawatir narrations establish that for a muqim, for a resident, you have 24 hours. For a traveler, you have 3 days, 3 days and 3 nights. That's through mutawatir narrations. You have some khabr ahad narrations that mention less than that. Now, because these two contradict, you have 2 hadith, both are sahih. If you look at the check marks, they're sahih. However, the Hanafis don't regard this as sahih, as do many other scholars as well, because they say it has a hidden defect. The hidden defect is that it contradicts a mutawatir narration, which is the Prophet ﷺ gave 1 day, meaning 24 hours for the resident for wiping over their socks, the period, and 3 days and 3 nights for the traveler. And this narration that's sahih, checks all the marks of the 5 conditions, has a hidden defect according to the fuqaha, And that hidden defect is that it contradicts a greater hadith, right? So that's an example of contradicting khabr ahad. All right. All right, so here's another example as well. This is when khabr ahad, and this is not only in the Hanafi madhab. Actually, let me give you this same example through the companions, right? So you had, and I'm going to paraphrase the story, during the time of Umar radiallahu anh, you had a situation that came up where they were trying to determine, or Umar was trying to determine the inheritance for a certain spouse that was, there was some issues, that was recently divorced or whatnot, and they were trying to determine the spousal support or the inheritance that would take place when the person passed away for the spouse. And one of the companions, a female companion, came up and she said, I was in a similar situation and the Prophet ﷺ did not allocate anything for me. So I was in a similar situation, the Prophet ﷺ did not give me anything. Now that is a hadith because it's narrated by a companion. She's a companion and she's narrating from the Prophet ﷺ. She's saying that this is what the Prophet ﷺ did, right? This is, he didn't allocate any funds for me. Umar radiallahu anh does not take that narration. And he says that it contradicts, his reasoning was that it contradicts the general principle that throughout the Quran, this is a qa'id or qawa'id kulliya, a general principle of Islam, that throughout the Quran, anytime you have these situations, you have some money being allocated. Throughout the hadith, the body of hadith, you have money being allocated, that there's always money, there's always some sort of spousal support. And then you have this companion narrating in contradiction to that. Because it contradicts a general established principle, right? We won't take that hadith. There's some defect that we don't know, right? There's some hidden defect. Now, a hidden defect does not mean that the person that's narrating it by default is lying, right? That's not the default answer to it. It just means it could be something as simple as they didn't hear the full hadith, or they didn't fully understand the situation, or like the examples that we gave, that they entered when the hadith was being narrated towards the end and they narrated the portion that they heard. And in that case, we had Aisha correcting it, but in other cases, you don't. So you have these conditions set by the fuqaha to determine and to eliminate any possibilities of shadh narrations, of isolated narrations or whatnot. So this is qa'ida kulliyah, that if it contradicts a general principle of Islam, then that khabr ahad is not taken because it has a hidden defect. Yes, it can be sahih, but it has a hidden defect. It can be sahih in terms of zahir, the outward appearance, the major conditions or whatnot, but there's a hidden defect. All right, let's look at one or two more examples and then we'll close with that, inshallah. All right, so we'll look at two examples. We'll look at a concept known as umum al-balwa, and then we'll look at the actions of the narrator. And I think the action of the narrator, I think I've given that example previously, but I don't remember if I did or not. So the first one that we said we'll look at is umum al-balwa, and this is a widespread, something that's widespread and a widespread practice. One of the conditions of accepting khabr ahad is that it cannot contradict something or contain a ruling, sorry, not contradict, it cannot contain a ruling that concerns a widespread action, right? That concerns a widespread action. And that is, the reasoning behind that is pretty much this, that because this is such a widespread thing that it doesn't make sense that only one or two people have heard of this. Right? It doesn't make sense that only one or two people are narrating this. And one of the examples, let me see what example he gives here. Okay, I don't see what example he gives here, but I don't have all the pages on my notes. Okay, so one of the examples is that there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in which, and actually some of the madhabs use this hadith, in which the Prophet ﷺ says that if you touch your private parts, then you have to repeat wudu. You have to do wudu. It breaks your wudu, pretty much. And this hadith is rejected by the Hanafis in terms of the ruling. They say it doesn't break your wudu. It's actually, I think, only accepted by the Hanbalis. Right? So I think the Malikis don't use this. I'm pretty sure the Shafi'is don't either. And the reason why is that, at least the Hanafi reasoning why, is that it addresses something that's umum al-balwa, that it's something that relates to everybody, right? But it's khabr wahid, meaning there's only a very few people narrating this. That why is it something that concerns the entire community and that everybody's, everybody, it can relate to every single individual on a personal level, but only one or two people or three people narrating this, right? So it contradicts umum al-balwa, or not contradicts, but it concerns the entire community, right? Which is umum al-balwa. It's a widespread thing, but there's a very few narrations, so it doesn't make sense. So they have this condition of umum al-balwa, that if it is something that concerns the entire community at an individual level, then it has to be narrated through mutawatir, that more people have to have heard about this. And they just say that the reasoning behind it might not be that it means the wudu is broken. It might just be that it's not good to do. It might be an earlier ruling. There might be some other explanation or reasoning behind why none of the other companions are narrating this, and there's only one or two chains coming to us for this. The last one that we'll do as an example is the khabr wahid, right? The khabr ahad or khabr wahid cannot be something that the narrator of the hadith, especially in terms of the companion, acts contrary to or speaks contrary to. So they act different to what they're narrating, or they later on speak or give fatwa to what they're narrating. And one of the examples of this is Abu Hurairah radiallahu an. He narrates that if a dog licks, something, then you have to wash it 7 times. However, this ruling, the hadith is sahih, right? So if a dog drinks from like a container or whatnot, it has to be washed 7 times. Now the hadith is sahih, right? You'll find this hadith graded as sahih. However, the fiqh ruling is that you only wash it 3 times. And the reasoning behind that is because there's other narrations by Abu Hurairah where he commands or where he talks about the dog licking the utensil and washing it only 3 times. And there's narrations that he acted contrary to it as well, that he washed it only 3 times. So the Hanafis say that if the companion narrating the hadith is acting contrary to it, right, then there's some other explanation that maybe it's not wajib, maybe it's just recommended to do. And they will at many times. Did I cut off? I don't know. They will at many times speak about how it's not mandatory, but rather it is recommended, or it moves below. So depending on whether the narrator of the hadith acts contrary to it or not. Another example that I can think of off the top of my head as well, and this is not the only reason why, but in the Hanafi madhab, having a wali is not a rukn or a necessary part of the marriage. So a woman can get married without a wali, and they base this off of multiple things. Some of them being that the Quran, the specific words used in the Quran, but I want to look at a specific proof that they use, which is Aisha radiallahu anha conducted the nikah of her niece when the niece's wali, who was the niece's father, was away. So he was away on a trip, and she conducted the nikah. Like she got her married off without the wali. And the hadith that are mentioned are from Aisha. So she's acted contrary to this. Or in general, that Aisha has acted contrary to that hadith of marrying without a wali. That if it was a necessary part of it, that Aisha radiallahu anha would not acted contrary to it, because the marriage wouldn't be valid. So that's just one of the many reasons that they use in that mas'ala, in that fiqh issue as well. So that summarizes for us a very, very, very dense topic, which is this overlap or the usage of hadith in fiqh. I hope it was as clear as it can be, especially for a very first introduction into this topic. So we will end with that, inshallah, and we'll open it up for Q&A. Let me stop the live stream first.